So there was a paper from 2014 that faced some criticism testing theories of American politics, elites, interest groups, and average citizens. And they looked at 1,779 policy changes from 1981 to 2002. In 2015, Martin Gilens did a follow-up where he looked at 2,245 policy changes from 1964 to 2006. And what these guys found was that policy changes were driven entirely by elite opinion and to a lesser extent by special interest opinion. According to them, average citizens' preference had almost no effect on policy change. Whether the average citizens 90% opposed a policy or 90% supported a policy, it still had about a 30% chance of happening. With economic elites, the story is radically different. If they all oppose something, it doesn't pass. If they all support it, it'll have a roughly 60% chance of getting passed. For interest groups, the important effects are around the middle, when interest groups began to net support a change. There were, of course, rebuttals to this. The main criticism was that median income Americans won 47% of the time. And as far as I'm aware, this is true, and Martin Gilens did not challenge this figure. But how can this be the case, and at the same time, this graph showing no apparent impact of average citizen opinion? How can this also be true? Well, the reason for this is thresholds. If 51% of average Americans support X and 49% of elites also support X, and X gets passed, then that's coded as the average citizens overpowering the elites, because the elites net oppose that. On the other hand, if 25% of average Americans support Y, but 75% of elites support Y, and then Y gets passed, that's then coded as the elites overpowering the average Americans, so that's one win for them. So, given these two events, it's 1 and 1, right? The average Americans and the elites are each winning about half the time, right? Of course, doing a straight win-loss criteria is grossly misleading as it hides the margins on each issue and doesn't fully capture the power rating of each group. What Gilens did was take a threshold, comparing instances in which 75% of elites or 75% of middle income people either supported or opposed a law. The first comparison was looking at policies they supported. When the affluent strongly favor a change, but the middle income doesn't strongly favor the change, it gets passed 55% of the time. If both the affluent and the middle incomes strongly favor something, it gets adopted 49% of the time, which would indicate a negative effect of middle income support. The same thing is seen when the affluent don't strongly support something. If the middle income also don't strongly support it, it gets passed 29% of the time. But if the middle income do strongly support a measure and the affluent strongly oppose it, it only gets passed 24% of the time. Again, indicating a negative impact of middle class support on an issue. Looking the other way, you see the impact of affluent support on something being between 26 points and 25 points. So the policies that get passed, or at least got passed between 1980 and 2002, were those that the rich supported and the middle class did not support. The same story can be seen in terms of killing policies that each group opposes. If the affluent strongly oppose a policy, but the middle class doesn't strongly oppose it, it's only adopted 4% of the time. If the affluent strongly oppose and the middle class also strongly opposes a policy, it gets adopted 15% of the time. If the affluent don't strongly oppose something and neither does the middle class, it gets adopted 34% of the time. If the affluent don't strongly oppose something, but the middle class does strongly oppose it, it gets adopted 40% of the time. Again, indicating a negative impact of middle class preference on policy that gets adopted. A follow-up was done in 2015, which expanded the number of policy changes analyzed to 2,245 and the year range to the years 1964 to 2006, and there was no significant difference in the results. Now, this finding made a bit of a splash at the time, back in 2014, but then just kind of went away. People forgot about it and went back to electoral politics, including me. I heard about this paper at the time, I thought it was interesting, but then I just sort of forgot about it. Trump supporters who have been paying attention are actually disappointed that Trump isn't getting his agenda passed, even though Trump's actual policies are pretty popular. So Trump should be getting most of his agenda passed, right? But it's not what the elites want. The elites want a financialized economy, a compliant labor force. But after reading Gilens 2014, Gilens 2015, I recalled this other paper I read on how regimes classified as autocracies respond to shifts in public opinion. From elections, information, and policy responsiveness in autocratic regimes, Mike Miller looked at what he classified as electoral authoritarian regimes. These are regimes which have elections and representatives, but the executive operates independent of any other branch. They're functionally a dictatorship, but they have a Congress as kind of an appendix. This unique situation allows for us to see an executive that doesn't have to legally respond to a Congress, but still gets the information of an election, which is salience-weighted public opinion. In Miller's analysis of 269 elections in 86 countries from 1975 to 2004, he found that a 20% loss in legislative seats for the autocrats' party corresponded to a 0.26% increase in education spending and a 0.29% increase in social welfare spending. A 20% increase in the seats of the ruling party corresponded to an increase in military spending of 1.65%. Now, with these countries classed as electoral authoritarian regimes, they're starting with much lower levels of education and welfare spending than the US is at now. So I don't think it would be appropriate to use these metrics as an indicator of policy responsiveness in the US. Moreover, the US doesn't have as wild electoral swings as most other countries do, which I think is due to the US really being something like 7 or 8 countries averaged together, with each one of them thinking they're the real America. But with Gilens, it appears as if there is no effect of popular opinion on policy outcomes in the US. Whereas with Miller, it appears in these electoral authoritarian regimes, the regime is actually more responsive to public opinion than the US federal government. And suddenly I'm reminded of one of Hans Hermann Hoppe's arguments for monarchy. As a politician, you're an actor within a government. You are not intimately tied to the general health of the country. In fact, if you're a senator, you can gesticulate and claim that you had nothing to do with anything bad that happened or anything perceived to be bad happened in the country. Even as president in the US, you can say your ability to act was constrained by the Congress or the courts, that you inherited a mess from the other guy, that you only had 4 or 8 years to implement your plan. And maybe it's really true. Maybe there really is no single actor or group of actors that you can blame in the US. The buck doesn't stop anywhere. But if you're, say, Pinochet, and you have total ultimate control over everything going on in Chile, well, if something goes badly, there's no one else to hide behind. You can't blame the Republicans or whatever because you're the only ones in power. In the US, you can pick a side. And then if anything goes wrong, it's either because of the other side, or if your policy was implemented and that went wrong, well, it's because of those lousy Democrats corrupted the policy, or the Republicans crippled Obamacare. It wasn't really what we wanted. There's all sorts of games you can play. The system is sufficiently complicated that you can always find some plausible out. So the buck never stops anywhere. So non-sham electoral politics, or what we think of as non-sham electoral politics in the US, it diverts your energy away from the things that could actually challenge the regime and redirects you down the blind alley of electoral politics. Here, run around in this little idiot box a bunch, hit the pads, tire yourself out. Okay, you elected Donald Biden or whatever. Yay, you won. Oh, better luck next time. Now back in your cage. In other electoral authoritarian regimes, the public knows that the elections are a sham. But what if you had an electoral authoritarian regime where the public was well and truly conned and truly believed that elections mattered? Well, you'd have a level of control beyond any dictatorship, because at least open dictatorships now have the burden and the odium of being a dictatorship, and have the policy buck stopping at them. And while direct action is the only way to throw out a dictator, at least the public knows this fact. And the fact that in these banana republics the population knows the elections are shams is possibly why those regimes are more responsive to changes in public opinion than in the US.
Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. Inevitable.